who is the greatest among you. Let him be servant of all. In our session today, we are going to be looking at a passage of Scripture that would answer the question, can God use a young man from a dysfunctional family? And you might wonder, I wonder where that would be found in the Scriptures. And we're going to be looking at a 17-year-old boy who was very different and ended up impacting his own nation and the nation of Egypt. And we're going to track through that. I will entitle this, How Does a Dream Become a Reality? In other words, somebody would have a dream. How does that dream become a reality? And what would be the purpose of that dream? I remember a hockey player named Travis Waugh, last name spelled R-O-I, and he had a dream to be starting for Boston University on the hockey team. His father coached him through youth hockey, all the way from as a child, all the way up through high school hockey. And then when he went to juniors, he maintained the dream, and his dad followed along with that, encouraging him. And finally the day came when Travis Waugh had his dream become a reality. From a childhood to now being a starter on Boston University hockey team. The game was there. It was in the home arena. And as the game started, he was on the ice playing, I believe, left wing. And 11 seconds into the game, he went into the corner. Travis went into the corner. And it was not a hard hit, but he slumped down to the ice. And so the coach, his father who was on the bench, along with the coach and the other team members, the dad, the medical guy, and the father went out on the ice, and his father said, Travis, get up, there's a game to play, teasing him like he had all through his childhood. And Travis said, Dad, I can't move. And the second thing he said, Dad, I made it. In other words, he made the dream that he had, but it lasted 11 seconds. And I remember the sports article, the magazines published that, and they call it the 11-second dream. You will still see Travis Waugh in professional hockey games on the bench. He's with the people who were on his team. They will have him come to games sometime in his wheelchair. He started a foundation, the Travis Waugh Foundation, and yet a dream that lasted 11 seconds. And I stopped to think, how long will your dream last? That's why I want to look in Genesis chapter 37, and I want to pick my text from verse 5. Genesis chapter 37 and verse 5. I don't normally take one text or one phrase and build a message around that, but I'm going to do that today and then follow it through a couple different chapters of the Bible. Genesis chapter 37 and verse 5, and Joseph dreamed a dream. Now there's the phrase, Joseph dreamed a dream. And it told it his brethren, and they hated him yet the more. But here we find a lad who was in his youth in a very dysfunctional family. And if you can find a more dysfunctional family than Jacob's, I'd sure like to find out more about that family. That would be an interesting family. But let's look in verse 2 of chapter 37 of Genesis. These are the generations of Jacob. Joseph being 17 years old. There we identify the age of this young man. 17 years old, was feeding the flock with his brethren, And the lad was with the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives. And Joseph brought unto his father their evil report. Now Israel loved Joseph more than all his children, because he was the son of his old age, and made him a coat of many colors. And as when his brethren saw that their father loved him more than all his brethren, they hated him, and could not speak peaceably unto him. And Joseph dreamed a dream. Now, how did Joseph, with his dream, see that dream become a reality? I'm going to go through three things that in this session. I'm going to do one of the sessions today on the fact that how does a dream become a reality? In other words, I have a dream, maybe to be a medical doctor, or you have a dream to be a godly housewife, or you have a dream to be an attorney, or you have a dream. How does a dream become a reality? And we're going to look at that. Number one, Joseph had a dream become real because he had conviction before he faced a crisis. And as godly leaders, as godly men, as godly women, those who have goals, as godly teenagers have goals to grow up to get to the mission field, perhaps a dream to be the first one to say the name of Jesus Christ in some culture, never hearing that name before. And I think when we see the dream that Joseph had, obviously that dream was that the nations would be bowing down to him. And as we look at the verse 4, and when his brethren saw that their father loved him more than all his brethren, they hated him and could not speak peaceably unto him. And Joseph dreamed a dream, and he told it his brethren, and they hated him yet the more. And he said unto them, Hear, I pray you, this dream I have dreamed. For behold, we were binding sheaves in the field, and lo, my sheaf arose and stood upright, and behold, your sheaf stood round about and made obeisance to my sheaf. Basically, the dream that Joseph was sharing to his half-brothers is that one day you will be bowing down to me. Then he had another dream, and that the sun and the moon would bow down to him, indicating that his mother and father would be bowing down to him. That did not happen in that culture. Now, how did this happen? With the hatred of his brethren, with the mentality of the world around him at that time, how did this 17-year-old function? First of all, we see the conviction he had before a crisis was in a pattern that he had early on in life. One thing that has to be true, that patterns are built in early in life. I think patterns of obedience, patterns of debt-free living, patterns of being responsible, things that should be built right into the character early on in life. And we see that he had a pattern. What was one of the patterns? He had a pattern not to conform to evil that was around him. In verse 2 there, he was with the brethren, the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, and they were his half-brothers. The wives of Jacob, Bilhah and Zilpah, had sons. They were wicked young men, and he did not conform to the evil that was in them. When Joseph had to work with them, I'm sure the pressure had to be very great on this young man. And yet, he didn't conform. You notice that phrase that he brought unto his father their evil report. In other words, when he went out with them, whatever evil they were doing, whatever sin they were committing, had to be very obvious and very grieving to this young man. He did not conform. Secondly, he had a pattern not to conceal evil. He had a pattern that he would not conceal the evil that his brothers were doing. I think he had such a love for them and such a care for them that he had to go and tell Dad. Say, Dad, this is what these boys are doing. They will destroy themselves. He went back and reported it. It's so strange sometimes in our culture that they say, well, you don't rat on someone because of peer pressure. And yet here was a 17-year-old boy who could see that these young men were putting themselves into destruction. And he felt if somebody knew, they could help to stop or counsel at least. And Joe, I'm sure, was hoping that his father Jacob would do something to stop and to counsel that evil that was going on at that time. And I would encourage young people, any young people who are watching at this point, you have friends who you see are drifting into a pattern of evil. You see habits that are beginning to build into their lives. And you say, well, I'm not going to rat on anybody. If you love those young men, if you love those young ladies, you would not hesitate to reveal the things that they're going to go into to destroy themselves. You talk to them one-on-one first, but then you go to some authority who can give some advice and some help to give them counsel and guidance to make the right choices that they need to make in life. And number 3, he didn't contend. He did not contend. We find that when his brothers, in a reaction, went to attack him, he never fought back, never one time. In fact, Dad sent him out in verse 20 and following, sent him out to check on how the brethren were doing, and they saw him coming, and they said, "Oh, here comes the dreamer. Let's kill him." And instead of that, Reuben, the older brother, said, no, let's sell him. Here come the Ishmaelites. That's a camel train on the way to Egypt. Let's sell him. He can be sold as a slave. And so they decided to sell him. But there was not any picture of him ever contending with them. And then fourthly, he did not complain. That was another pattern. Did not complain. Not one time in the life of this young man do we see him complaining about his circumstance in life. When I speak to youth camps, I speak to the young people. I said, what would you do if you got home from camp? And a lot of times they get a kick out of that. So I said, you get home from camp, and all of your belongings are out in the front yard, and your older brothers are grinning, saying, we sold you to Cuba while you were at camp. Now, what would he think? I mean, you would be on your cell phones clicking, and you would be giving people a piece of your mind, which many of you cannot spare, and you would be complaining, and you would be contending, but not Joseph. The pattern that he built in was very, very unique for a young man in that stature. Let me ask this. What patterns have we built into our life? You young people, what patterns are you building into your life? Are you building a pattern to conform? Romans 12:1 and 2, be not conformed to this world, be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you might prove the good, acceptable, and perfect will of God. Have you had a tendency to be silent when evil is going on, and you could make a statement or make a step that would help these people in that? Or do you find yourself being very contentious to fight back and get even? Or do you find yourself complaining about this? And we look at what this young man did. He had a pattern that was there. Number 2, he had a purpose that was very clear. He did not have a divided heart. His drive was very unique. He did not have a lazy mentality. He had a drive to excel. He had a drive to do what needed to be done. And I remember I was invited to speak to the Iron Mountain High School football team. They were going down to Class C state championship. They were going to play in the Silver Dome in Pontiac, Michigan. And they were going against it was actually the best team in Lower Michigan, Class C. I believe on that team there was a running back that ended up playing for the Oakland Raiders. He was the best high school running back in the United States at that time. And as they were making this preparation, so the coach of that team contacted a friend of mine to see if I would come and speak to that high school team as they prepared to go to the Class C state championship. They were in their championship run. They were doing the play downs in Upper Michigan, and then they were going to go down and play in the Silver Dome. And so I got in, and I had played football up in the very tip of Upper Michigan for Calumet High School. So I was very familiar with their season and very familiar with their weather conditions. And that time of the year, getting toward the end of October, wet, rain, cold, occasional snow would be mixed in with that rain. And they were just coming in off the practice field, and the coach told them to sit down in their wet, old, grimy practice uniforms from that muddy practice field. And he said, I have someone here to talk to us today. And had them sit down in their wet uniforms in the locker room on the benches. And he wanted me to speak on how do you win a championship. And when I stood up, I said, how do you win championships? I said, you don't win a championship by dreaming about banners in your gym or dreaming about a trophy in your trophy case. How do you win a championship? And I said, if you're the quarterback and you're thinking of a banner or you're thinking of a trophy, you don't know where that ball is going to go because your mind is not there. Now, if I'm the wide receiver and I'm thinking banner and trophy, the ball might hit me in the head as I'm going out for a pass. I'm not thinking, no. I said, what you do, you win a championship one play at a time. One play at a time. I said, if you're the quarterback, so I'm under center as the quarterback, I'm backing up. I have that play in my mind. I have that receiver in my mind, and that's what I'm thinking, not banners, not trophies. If I am a defensive back and they're coming against me in that, I have that play in mind. And I said, if you play this game one play at a time, you're going to find yourself coming home with a championship. Or you have given yourself and left nothing on the field, even if you don't win a championship, because you've done it one play at a time. And lo and behold, they came back. They went down to Pontiac Silverdome, came back with the Class C state championship. And the coach said to this friend, tell Les, we won the state championship one play at a time. But now, I switched the challenge. I said, how do you become a champion in life? I said, you become a champion in life one choice at a time. Choices have consequences. I am becoming what I'll be in 5 years, in 10 years, one choice at a time. And as we look at Joseph, he came to a time in his life when he had to make a very crucial choice. If the dream was going to be a reality or if the dream was going to die. And we will cover that in our next segment after we do this introductory segment of this. One choice at a time. That's true for fathers, it's true for pastors, it's true for mothers, it's true for you young people who are preparing to go into life with a dream to become something that would make an impact on this world for God's glory. It's one choice at a time. And as you look at the opportunities to do what needs to be done, this friend who was a pro ball player had 5 World Series rings. And he said, we would play the first day of spring training, preparing for the World Series. He said, so we would, after the regular practice, we would get someone to bat. We would get somebody to play first base and catch and pitch, and we would create scenarios. There's one out, runner on first and second, the ball comes here. Now, what do I do with that ball? He said, we did the right thing so often when there was no pressure that when we were in the pressure of a World Series, we did the right thing automatically. And boy, what a lesson that is for us. You learn to do the right thing so often when there is no crisis that when you hit a crisis, you will do the right thing automatically because your mind has been trained to be sensitive to what God has for you. Now, as his dream was very unique, the dream that mom and dad would bow, the dream that his brothers would bow, that didn't mean that he was going to just gloat because they were bowing. It indicated that he would be in a very high position of authority and a high position of responsibility. What a drive. But he knew he had to have conviction about that drive. Secondly, his dream was very unique. That dream that he was going to be a very high position. Yes, he had a drive to glorify God. He had a drive to obey God. But his dream that he was going to be in a very high position. And then thirdly, his dress was very unique. Coat of many colors. Now, what was significant about that coat? Because that coat spoke of progenitorship. It spoke of priority. It spoke of priesthood. It spoke also of purity. I think one of the reasons his brothers hated him was because of the purity that was in his life. If you were to look at 2 Samuel chapter 13, you'll see the phrase, and Amnon had a friend whose name was Jonadab. Now, Amnon had a strong drive to have a physical relationship with his half-sister Tamar. It was making him sick, that lust that he had. And Jonadab came and said, what's wrong? And he told him that he had a strong desire for his half-sister. And Jonadab set up a plan and set up a situation and set up a scenario. And in that scenario and in that plan, Tamar was put into a trap. And Amnon was able to have his way with her. And in 2 Samuel chapter 13, after he had his way with her, he says, get out of my life. And it said the hatred wherewith he hated her was greater than the love wherewith he had loved her. And she said, where now shall I go? And it says, for she had a coat of many colors, which spoke of her purity. And I have to believe that this coat of many colors that Joseph had was a very special statement by his father that he was going to be in priority, that he was going to be in position, that he was going to have progenitorship, that he was going to have a double portion. But I believe it also spoke of the purity that Joseph had within his heart. We cannot live carelessly and recklessly regarding these matters. And I'm talking not only to young people, I'm talking to us as dads and us as grandpas and us as great-grandpas. Those desires never stop that would change us from one choice, put us into a tragic situation. His dress was very unique, and that dress spoke of the position that he would have. And as Joseph went through life, now we find him going out to meet his brothers. He is in responsibility. He is given a opportunity to do what needs to be done. And yet, he comes to a point, he gets sold. Now he's on a camel, or with a camel train going to Egypt. Now, I want us to turn to chapter 39, and we will see where he ends up after he was sold by his brethren. Genesis 39 and verse 1, and Joseph was brought down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, a captain of the guard, an Egyptian, bought him of the hands of the Ishmaelites, which have brought him down thither. And the Lord was with Joseph, He was a prosperous man, and he was in the house of his master, the Egyptian. So now his brothers sold him. His brothers made the money on him. And here he is. Put yourself in Joseph's place. 17-year-old boy, sold by his half-brothers. They had no care. In fact, they would have just soon killed him. And yet, he ends up being sold as a slave. And this young man, look in verse 2 of chapter 39, and the Lord was with Joseph. And he was a prosperous man, and he was in the house of his master, the Egyptian. And his master saw the Lord was with him, and that the Lord made all that he did to prosper in his hand. Now notice this, all of a sudden, he now is a slave. But it's so evident that God's hand was on him because of Joseph's fear of God and the love of God that he had. He was put in power, in prominence. He was very popular. Permissive society, parental absence, and of excellent physique. Everything that would have caused a young man to fall when the temptation came. And yet he stood very firmly. And in our next session, I'm going to deal with how did Joseph end up ruling in the number 2 spot in Egypt to the preservation of his own family and nation and to the preservation of the nation of Egypt. How did he end up to be in the number 2 spot to Pharaoh when he was in a perfect position to fall into the trap that had been set for him? How did the dream become a reality? And we're going to follow up on that in our next segment. And we see, number 1, he had conviction before he faced a crisis. May God give us the strength of conviction to stand when the temptation would be so strong to do otherwise. God, have your perfect way. Oh God, impress the truth on our hearts and minds. May we love you supremely, and may we be focused on you. In Jesus' name, amen.